Greetings. This is Matt Poole, one of the Visitor Services staff at Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. This narrated presentation is intended to provide refuge volunteers, interns, friends, and others with a brief introduction to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Wildlife Refuge System, Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, and to the 3 other refuges administered by the Parker River staff. A few simple points. National wildlife refuges are part of the federal government. They are not as well known or understood as, say, national parks. Raising public awareness about refuges can only help to improve public support for wildlife conservation. Parker River, combined with the other 560 national wildlife refuges, comprise the National Wildlife Refuge System. The refuge system is one of several divisions or programs within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service, along with 9 other federal agencies, is housed within the U.S. Department of Interior. And finally, the Interior Department, along with all of the other federal departments, comprises the President's Cabinet. All refuge employees wear the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service uniform, and all refuge employees ultimately work for the President. Many of the U.S. government's land management agencies are housed within the Interior Department. 2 of the other agencies are the National Park Service and Bureau of Land Management. Both the Secretary of Interior and Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are appointed by the President and confirmed in the U.S. Senate. There is also a regional director for each of our agency's 8 geographic regions. Regional directors are not politically appointed. Our regional director, Wendy Weber, Director of the Northeast Region, works out of our regional office in Hadley, Massachusetts. Note that while our business is indeed wildlife and habitat conservation, we do this work with a host of partners, and we do this work for the American people. While National Wildlife Refuges may be the most visible element of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the agency is involved in a lot of very other important conservation work, as is shown on this slide. A number of these other functions often intersect on national wildlife refuges, such as the responsibility for protecting and managing for the conservation of threatened and endangered species. Piping plovers are an obvious example of this intersection at Parker River. The Fish and Wildlife Service can be described as relatively decentralized. I've already mentioned the geographic regions, each with their respective regional director. There is also a national office, split between Washington, D.C. and Falls Church, Virginia. Approximately 9,000 individuals work for the agency, a relatively small number by federal agency standards. The 560-plus unit National Wildlife Refuge System conserves approximately 150 million acres of land and water. Refuges exist in every corner of the U.S., including Alaska, Hawaii, the Virgin Islands, and even Guam. Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge in Florida, the nation's first national wildlife refuge, was established by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1903. Refuges range in size from several acres like Pelican Island to Alaska's 19 million acre Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. While I won't dwell on the range of laws that inform or affect national wildlife refuges, it is important to touch upon the Refuge Improvement Act, which was passed in 1997. The Act's main components include a strong and singular wildlife conservation mission for the refuge system, a requirement to maintain the biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health of the refuge system, a new process for determining compatible uses on refuges, a recognition that wildlife-dependent recreational uses involving hunting, fishing, wildlife observation and photography, and environmental education and interpretation, when determined to be compatible, are the 6 priority general public uses of the refuge system, and finally, a requirement for preparing a comprehensive conservation plan or general management plan for each refuge. The Fish and Wildlife Service, including National Wildlife Refuges, depends heavily on volunteers to accomplish our mission. Volunteers perform pretty much every type of work you can imagine, and their contribution is huge. Just look at the collective value of their contribution back in 2012, almost $40 million. Finally, before we move on to take a close look at Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, I wanted to quickly mention that our refuge is located within the Northeast region of the agency. The region embraces 13 states and extends from Maine to Virginia. This slide shows the names and location for each of the 4 refuges administered by the Parker River staff. The other 3 are Great Bay, Wapak, and Thatcher Island National Wildlife Refuges. I'll touch upon these other 3 in a couple of minutes. So, let us now train our focus on Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. Reflecting back to an earlier comment about increasing the visibility and public awareness quotient of national wildlife refuges, the words Plum Island are certainly more familiar to most local people than are the words Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. It does help for staff and volunteers to tactfully remind visitors that Parker River is a national wildlife refuge and not an Audubon sanctuary, national park, or state reservation. Here's a beautiful view of Plum Island, looking north from the southern end at Sandy Point. Plum Island is about 9 miles long, north to south. The southern 2/3 is owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. About 1,400 homes exist on the northern third. The refuge was established in the early 1940s as a nesting, resting, and feeding site for migratory waterfowl, particularly for the black duck. The refuge sits smack dab in the middle of the Atlantic Flyway and serves as a stopover site for myriad bird species as they complete their migration twice each year. Not surprisingly, Parker River is one of the top destinations on the East Coast for birders and bird photographers. Regarding the final bullet on this slide, Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge, located on Maryland's eastern shore, is the most visited refuge in the Northeast region. About 1.4 million visitors travel to Chincoteague each year, compared to the 250,000 who typically come to Parker River. An overview of Parker River National Wildlife Refuge would not be complete without mentioning the connection between the refuge and legendary conservationist Rachel Carson. Carson, who served for a time as the chief editor for the Fish and Wildlife Service, traveled to Plum Island in 1946 to gather background information for an interpretive publication she would later write about the refuge. Published in 1947, the Carson authored Conservation in Action document about the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge is available for download from the refuge website. Stepping back to the present, this is the talented year-round, interdisciplinary staff that work at the refuge. Our efforts are greatly leveraged by over 100 dedicated volunteers and an extremely supportive friends group, the Friends of Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. For a relatively small refuge, Parker River contains a surprising diversity of wildlife habitats. Starting at the ocean's shoreline and moving west, the first habitat encountered is the Atlantic Ocean beach. Here is where piping plovers and least terns build their nests and raise their young during the warmer months. And here is where shorebirds of all variety find their meals in the rackline, the band of seaweed and other organic debris that is left on the beach by each retreating tide. Next are the dunes, or what I like to call the dune lands. The variety of plants and animals found here can be surprising. It's a harsh environment for sure, but one that has been overcome with some pretty interesting plant and animal adaptations. Two descriptors that come to mind when trying to characterize the maritime forest are thick and impenetrable. It's an extremely valuable habitat type, one that provides a host of bird species, both migratory and resident, with protective cover and food. And then, of course, there's the salt marsh. Thousands of acres of it, in fact. Often called the nursery of the sea, it's been said that about 85% of all marine species are tied, either directly or indirectly to the salt marsh. An alarming amount of our original healthy salt marsh, up and down both coasts, has been lost to development. The Refuges salt marsh habitat is part of the 20,000 plus acre Great Marsh, one of the few remaining intact and healthy salt marsh complexes remaining along the New England coast. The final wildlife habitat I'll mention is called an impoundment. These human-constructed ponds are a common feature on many national wildlife refuges, and how they function is pretty simple. Water levels are manipulated at different times of the year to favor different groups of birds. Typically, water levels are drawn down in the warmer months, sometimes right down to exposed mudflat to benefit shorebirds. Water levels are then raised during the colder months to provide habitat for waterfowl. This is the basic regimen in place for the impoundments at Parker River. Managing wildlife and their habitats is really the core mission of any national wildlife refuge. At Parker River, with over 3,000 acres of salt marsh, the biological staff, along with a variety of partners, devotes considerable time and effort to a host of issues and priorities related to this valuable and vulnerable wildlife habitat. The threat of sea level rise has only served to further invigorate this focus. I often joke that the piping plover is Parker River's poster child. The Atlantic coast population of this shorebird was listed as threatened under Federal Endangered Species Act in 1986. That is just one step away from being endangered. Piping plover numbers decline because of habitat loss, habitat degradation, and predation. Bottom line, people and plovers, at least during the breeding season, don't mix very well. So our plover management at Parker River is remarkably simple and effective. The beaches are closed to public access during the plover breeding season. Most refuges devote significant time and resources to the management and control of non-native invasive species. Whether plant or animal, invasive species tend to outcompete and displace native species, depreciating the wildlife value of a landscape. At Parker River, the two invasive species receiving the most significant management attention at present are Phragmites, or common reed, and perennial pepperweed. An earlier slide about the Refuge Improvement Act made reference to the mandate that every refuge have a management plan or comprehensive conservation plan. Parker River's CCP has been under development for several years now. Before being finalized, the draft plan will be released for public comment. The CCP is expected to be finalized in 2019. Now let's shift our attention to the Refuge's Visitor Services Program. Right off the bat, it's important to point out that Parker River is extremely lucky to have such a wonderful visitor center. The building includes an exhibit gallery, 75-seat auditorium, and a multi-purpose classroom. Most national wildlife refuges do not have this type of facility. Parker River is fortunate to be able to participate in the federal recreation fee program. While the daily entrance fee is $5 per vehicle, certain passes, along with a federal duck stamp, allow refuge visitors to get in for free. The really good news? 80% of the entrance fee revenues stay at the refuge to be expended on visitor services. This map, taken from the official refuge brochure, is a great tool for pointing out all of the visitor services infrastructure that can be enjoyed on the refuge. Communications and outreach lie at the heart of an effective visitor services program. We attempt to get the word out in a number of ways. First, there's the recently redesigned Refuge website. It's chock full of valuable information. The Refuge also produces a quarterly newsletter called the Rack Line. Finally, not one but two Facebook pages help to spread the good word about what is happening at the Refuge. One page represents the Refuge, the other is an extension of the Refuge's very active photography program. The Big Six priority wildlife-dependent public uses, as mandated by Congress, drive much of the visitor services program at any national wildlife refuge. Again, each of the public uses on this slide are wildlife-dependent and therefore flow directly from the missions of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Wildlife Refuge System. Two forms of hunting occur at Parker River. There is a one-day lottery deer hunt every December, and waterfowl hunting occurs in certain areas of the salt marsh within the refuge boundary during the state season. Surf fishing for stripers, bluefish, and flounder from the refuge beach is a long-held cultural tradition at the refuge and is supported in a number of ways. The refuge provides access to clam flats and parking for people that have been issued shellfishing permits by local towns. As previously mentioned, the refuge is a mecca for birding enthusiasts. Refuge staff and volunteers frequently encounter foreign visitors who have traveled to the refuge to check off additional species on their life list. The refuge has a very active and multifaceted nature and wildlife photography program. A photo club called the Photo Society of Parker River holds monthly meetings and supports a number of photography-related programs and events across the year. There is an annual photo contest, the winners of which are announced during the annual Conservation Film Festival held every March. There are a variety of trails and boardwalks on the refuge that provide a wealth of opportunities to view wildlife and their habitats and otherwise facilitate immersive nature experiences. Recently, a new trail was opened on Stage Island. For the first time in more than 75 years, refuge visitors are able to walk all the way to the scenic tip of the island to an area known as the Ipswich Bluffs. The recent addition of a water trail, along with the introduction of ranger-led kayak tours, provide visitors with a new way to experience the refuge's most expansive wildlife habitat, the salt marsh. There are a number of places on the refuge with visitors in wheelchairs or who may have other mobility impairments can observe wildlife in their habitats. Environmental education can mean something as simple as children exploring life between the tides or adults identifying animals from tracks left in the snow during a winter program. Still, this is an area where the refuge can and will be doing more with the help of newly trained, enthusiastic volunteer naturalists. Like most national wildlife refuges, Parker River conducts a number of free public events across the year, each designed to draw people to the refuge and to its visitor center, all with the goal of tuning them in and turning them on to wildlife and nature. Now let's take a look at the other three refuges administered by the Parker River staff. Great Bay National Wildlife Refuge is located in Newington, New Hampshire. Established in 1992, the refuge is comprised of approximately 1,200 acres of the former Pease Air Force Base. Open sunrise to sunset, the refuge offers visitors two trails, the quarter-mile, wheelchair-accessible Upper Peverly Pond Boardwalk and the 2-mile-long William Ferber Ferryway Loop Trail. Photographs tell the story. Great Bay is a beautiful refuge and provides refuge visitors with a variety of opportunities to view wildlife and their habitats. Wapak National Wildlife Refuge is located near Peterborough, New Hampshire. Established in 1972, Wapak is a hiker's paradise. The final northern 4 miles of the Wapak Trail passes right through the refuge. Hikers can enjoy expansive views from the summit of North Pack Monadnock Mountain. The natural beauty of this refuge speaks for itself. The Friends of Wapak are very good refuge partners. Its members do most of the trail maintenance at Wapak, a fact that is greatly appreciated by the Parker River staff. Finally, there is Thatcher Island National Wildlife Refuge, located a mile off the coast of Rockport, Massachusetts. Thatcher Island is both remote and unique. The 50-acre island is perhaps best known for its elegant twin lighthouses. The Fish and Wildlife Service owns both the northern half of the island and the North Lighthouse Tower. A former nesting site for common terns, the terns were long ago displaced by two species of gull. Limited refuge management activities on the island consist of discouraging gull nesting with the long-term goal of returning the island to a tern nesting site. During the warmer months, and for a small fee, transportation to and from the island is provided by the nonprofit Thatcher Island Association, an organization that has proven to be a wonderful refuge partner. You can expect to see lots of gulls during a visit to Thatcher Island. Finally, the Parker River staff also oversees and administers the Carner Blue Butterfly Conservation Easement located in Concord, New Hampshire. The relatively small patch of native pine barren provides essential habitat for a federally endangered butterfly called the Carner Blue. Fish and Wildlife Service staff work very closely with the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department on efforts to help this little butterfly. So there you have it, a brief introduction to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Wildlife Refuge System, and the National Wildlife Refuges supported by Parker River's staff. Thanks for listening.